Now let us see the next LOS. Okay, so in the next LOS they are saying us to compute, calculate, compare and contrast the various yield spread measure. So there are some yield spread measures that they are having, and you have to compute them, compare and contrast each of them. Please note that here you have to remember the formula of all these spreads. Okay, so let us see what are these spread. Okay, first is the absolute yield spread. Okay, so it is absolute yield spread. Okay, please note that whenever you come across this word spread, it means that spread is nothing but a difference. Okay, now the difference here, it can be compared from the treasury bond. Okay, or it can be compared with respect to any benchmark bond. Okay, now to understand this illustration of the treasury benchmark, okay, think about you have a General Motors bond. Okay, the General Motors bond are currently giving you a yield of 8% per annum, right? And then you have a US government treasury bill, okay, treasury bond. Okay, let's say this bond is for 5 years and this treasury bond is also for 5 years. Okay, and so naturally, because the risk is lower in the treasury, it should be trading at lower than 8%. Assume that this treasury is trading at the 6% yield. So the yield that you get from the treasury is 6% per annum, right? Okay, now since the General Motors is coming a part of the automobile sector, okay, so you can also have a benchmark bond for the automobile sector. So you say that a 5-year automobile sector average bond, okay, automobile sector average bond, it is trading at 7% per annum, right? So here we are considering a case where the sector is having lower risk as compared to the particular bond. It may happen that the sector may have higher risk also, but here we have taken a case where the sector is lower. In fact, the CFA curriculum, you will find that they are saying that the sector is having lower risk as compared to the specific bond in that sector. So this sector is nothing but your benchmark. So we have the automobile sector as the benchmark, right? Okay, so let us try to understand then what is the absolute yield spread. Absolute yield spread is just the difference between the YTM of the risky bond, okay, or the higher yield bond. Okay, so we'll say that the risky bond or the higher yield bond minus the YTM of treasury or your lower yield bond. It is just computing the difference between the two bonds yield. Okay, so please note that this absolute yield spread, okay, here it says that, okay, just taking the difference of the YTM. So you will see that later, okay, this spread is also known as your nominal spread if you are comparing with respect to the treasury. So nominal spread, you will see that nominal spread is given as YTM of risky bond minus YTM of the treasury bond. Okay, so that is the definition of the nominal spread. So if your treasury is the benchmark over here, then it becomes the nominal spread, right? The computation is very similar, right? So very simple. Just you have to get the difference of the two yield. Okay, then you have next is the relative yield spread. Okay, so they are saying that, okay, find out what is relative yield spread. Okay, so the relative yield spread is given as, okay, the ratio of absolute yield spread. So your relative yield spread is the ratio of absolute yield spread and the yield of benchmark bond. So whatever the yield of your benchmark bond is, okay, so it is absolute yield spread divided by your yield of the benchmark bond. So here what happens is, suppose our benchmark, we are computing the relative yield spread of General Motor with respect to the automobile sector. Okay, so our absolute yield spread is how much? Okay, absolute yield spread will be 8% of the General Motors minus 7% of your automobile sector divided by 7%. So this will be 1% divided by 7%, or 1 by 7, or you can write as 0.142 8 roughly, right? So this is your relative yield spread. So relative yield spread is given as the absolute yield spread divided by the yield of the benchmark bond, right? Then the third definition that you have over here, that you have to compute yield ratio. So you have to find out the yield ratio of the bonds. Okay, yield ratio of the bond is yield of, okay, your bond, okay, the particular bond, or we'll say the yield of the higher yield bond, okay, because as I said that CFA curriculum, they are saying that higher yield bond is the specific bond and then you have the benchmark. Yield of higher yield bond, okay, divided by your yield of benchmark bond, okay, right? So yield of higher yield bond divided by yield of benchmark bond. So yield of higher yield bond is 8%, okay, yield of benchmark bond is 7%, right? So your yield ratio will become 8 by 7 or 1.1428. Okay. Now if you see over here, this yield ratio can be further simplified. Okay. Please see over here. Okay, what we can do is this 8 by 7. Okay, we can work as 7 and we can write as 7% plus 1%, right? And then we can write as 7% divided by 7% plus 1% divided by 7%, right? So this will become 1. And note that this 1% is nothing but the absolute yield spread. Okay, remember absolute yield spread is 8% of the General Motor bond, 7% of the benchmark bond. So the difference is 1%. So this is your absolute yield spread. So what you have is absolute yield spread divided by, now this 7% is nothing but the yield of the benchmark bond. So yield of benchmark bond. Now if you see this absolute yield spread divided by yield of benchmark bond, this is nothing but the relative yield spread. So what you have is yield ratio is equal to 1 plus relative yield spread, right? And if you see over here, yield ratio is actually equal to 1 plus relative yield spread. Okay, so these are the formulas that I would recommend you to remember. Absolute yield spread is yield on higher bond minus yield on lower bond. Relative yield spread is absolute yield spread by benchmark bond. By definition here, our benchmark bond would have a lower yield. Okay, then your yield ratio would be bond yield divided by your benchmark bond yield, right? Or it can also be written as 1 plus your relative yield spread, right? Okay, and here just a concept builder focuses on those concept problem solving. Don't worry, these are very simple. Okay, in fact I would prepare one Excel sheet and also send it to you.